Welcome everyone to this powerful journey into history. Before we begin, I invite you to become a proud member of Veteran Vault, where stories of courage, sacrifice, and resilience are preserved and honored for generations to come. Imagine being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, starving, freezing, and stripped of every comfort, yet still finding the strength to stand tall. In the darkest moments of history, when survival itself was uncertain, ordinary people revealed extraordinary courage. Their bodies were broken, but their spirit refused to surrender. This is not just a story of suffering, it is a powerful reminder of resilience, dignity, and the unbreakable will to survive. When it was finally my turn to be interrogated, I walked in expecting the usual questions. But the German guard looked at me with this strange confidence and said, "We already know everything about you." At first I thought it was just intimidation, but then he started listing details. My mother and father's names, where we lived, even that we had a dairy farm. He named my brother and sister, too. Hearing all that shook me more than I expected. Then he said something that sounded almost calm, almost reasonable. He told me I probably wanted my family to know I was alive. Of course I did. He handed me a Red Cross form and told me to fill it out. Name, rank, and then everything else. What plane I flew, what altitude we were at, what bombs we carried, and what our target was. I looked at that paper and handed it back with only my name, rank, and serial number filled in. That's when his tone changed completely. He lost his temper and started shouting, insisting they already knew I flew a B-17 and demanding I write it down. I refused. I stuck to giving just my name, rank, and serial number. He struck me hard across the head with his pistol, and for a moment everything went white. But every time he asked something, I gave him the same answer. Nothing more. He kept hitting me, trying to break me, but I wouldn't give in. Finally, he pointed the gun right at my head and warned me to answer properly or else. I took a breath, steadied myself, and once again repeated my name, rank, and serial number. That was all he was going to get from me. Before all of this, everything had started so differently. I still remember the morning we heard about Pearl Harbor. I was sitting at the breakfast table with my family. My mother was stunned, deeply worried that both my brother and I would be pulled into the war. Not long after that, on my 19th birthday, I enlisted. Training took me all over. Utah for basic training, Texas for mechanics, Florida for gunnery, and then Louisiana for flight training. Eventually, I ended up as a ball turret gunner. It wasn't something anyone volunteered for. In fact, I was the last one assigned because nobody else wanted it. I even tried to trade it away, but no one would take it. That turret was unbelievably tight, just about 3 feet across. It was meant for someone small, and even then it wasn't easy. I had to leave behind my heavy flight suit just to fit inside. Once in there, I was completely cramped, locked into this tiny space for hours at a time. Missions could last 10, 12, sometimes even 14 hours. I operated 2.50 caliber machine guns that could rotate fully around and almost straight up. Moving them was controlled by simple handles, tilting and turning them to aim. It sounds simple, but doing that while freezing and under fire was something else entirely. The cold was brutal. At high altitude, temperatures could drop to -60. My electric suit was supposed to help, but it was unreliable. A couple of times it completely failed, leaving me with no heat at all. Coming from a farm, I was used to harsh winters, but even then, nothing really prepares you for that kind of cold. My first mission wasn't too bad. It felt tense, but manageable. It was the second one that really showed me what war could be like. We were supposed to turn back because of bad weather, but somehow our crew never got the message. We flew on alone, straight into enemy fighters. They tore into us. One hit took out half of an engine, leaving a massive hole. Another ripped through the tail. It's a miracle we made it back at all. We ended up crash landing in a field we thought was a runway, barely missing obstacles in the fog. Then came February 22nd, 1944. That mission stayed with me more than any other. Our group was sent out as a decoy to draw enemy fighters away from the main targets. At first, it felt routine, even with enemy planes attacking along the way. But then, everything changed. I saw another plane nearby get hit and go down into the ocean. Just minutes later, it was our turn. There was a massive explosion, and immediately I knew we were in serious trouble. The pilot asked for the nearest land, and the navigator said we were 20 minutes away. 20 minutes doesn't sound long, but when your plane is on fire, it feels like forever. Explosions kept happening, one after another, sometimes every few seconds. The blasts were so powerful they would blow the flames out, only for the fire to ignite again moments later. That wing somehow held together the entire time, right up until we reached land. Then one final explosion tore part of it completely off. By then, I had already left the turret and prepared to jump. That time saved my life. We bailed out over land, and most of us made it. The pilot wasn't so lucky. He landed on a frozen lake, but the ice gave way beneath him. He called for help, and some locals tried to reach him, but German soldiers kept them away. He didn't make it. As for me, the jump itself was strangely calm in a way. After everything we had just gone through, stepping out into the air felt almost like relief. But what came after? That was a whole different kind of fight. The jump itself should have been straightforward, but nothing about that moment felt normal. One of the waist gunners was supposed to go first. He moved toward the exit, looked outside, and suddenly froze. For a second, everything stalled. There wasn't time to think, so I gave him a hard shove from behind and forced him out. Right after that, I followed. When I pulled my ripcord, nothing happened. For a split second, it felt like time stopped. But panic wasn't an option. I reached back quickly, grabbed the chute, and yanked it free myself. Thankfully, it opened. The landing wasn't gentle. I hit the ground hard, like a sack of bricks. The parachutes were intentionally made smaller to reduce the time you spent in the air, because enemy soldiers would often shoot at men drifting down. Less time in the sky meant slightly better odds. I came down in a muddy field, and before I could even think about moving, I realized I was surrounded. German soldiers had already formed a half circle around me, rifles pointed straight at me. There was no chance of escape. That was the moment I knew it was over. I was a prisoner now. They marched us to a school building they had taken over. That's where we spent the night. There were some questions, but nothing too intense at first. The real interrogation came later. By the third day, we were taken to another place. We hadn't eaten anything since being captured, and we'd barely had any water. Hunger and exhaustion were starting to take over. They brought us into a large room packed with hundreds of other prisoners waiting their turn. While we sat there, you could hear everything. Shouting, blows landing, men crying out, begging for mercy, and every now and then, a gunshot. It stayed with you. When my turn finally came, I was taken in by a guard who looked like something out of a war film. He was missing part of his arm, and his face was heavily scarred, one eye gone. He carried a weapon and used it to push and shove me where he wanted me to stand. Inside, the officer acted completely different. He was calm, almost friendly, like we were having a polite conversation. I gave him my name, rank, and serial number. He offered me a chair and a cigarette. I refused both and stayed standing. Then he tried a different tactic. He told me they already knew everything about me. To prove it, he pulled out a file and started listing details. My parents, where I grew up, even my family back home. Hearing that was unsettling, but I didn't let it show. He handed me a form and said I could send a message home through the Red Cross. It asked for basic personal details, but then it went further. Questions about the aircraft, the mission, the targets. I filled in only what I was allowed to give. My name, rank, and serial number. Nothing else. The moment I handed it back, his attitude flipped. He got angry, insisting I write down everything, claiming they already knew it anyway. I stayed quiet and repeated the same 3 things. That's when the beating started. He hit me across the head, hard enough to make my vision blur. Every time he asked something, I gave the same answer. The guard behind me started jamming the barrel of his gun into my back, over and over. It went on for what felt like forever. Eventually, the officer pointed his gun straight at my head and told me if I didn't answer properly, that would be the end of it. In that moment, you think about everything, but you also know what you can and can't do. I steadied myself and gave the same response again. He lashed out, kicking me so hard I was thrown toward the door. But strangely enough, that was the moment it ended. Later, I learned something important. If you gave them even a little bit of information, they would keep pushing, beating you for more and more. Holding the line was the only way through it. After that, they gave us something to eat for the first time in days. It was barely anything, a piece of bread with a thin layer of beet jelly. But when you've been starving, even that feels like a full meal. We didn't stay there long. Soon after, they loaded us onto a train. Before that, they had taken our shoes and socks, so we had to walk barefoot through the snow to reach the station. Every step burned. We were taken to a prison camp. Life there was harsh. Food was scarce, sometimes just one meal a day, sometimes less. Red Cross packages came occasionally, but never regularly. The cold was constant. There was no real heating, just bodies packed together trying to share what little warmth we could. Sometimes punishment came out of nowhere. If the Germans were irritated by news from the front, or if someone did something they didn't like, everyone paid for it. I remember one time someone damaged a picture of Hitler, and the consequences hit all of us. As time went on, we started noticing signs that the war was shifting. The Soviets were getting closer from the east. Every afternoon, we were ordered to close the shutters and keep them shut until morning. Even then, you could see flashes in the distance. Not long after, you could actually hear the rumble of artillery getting closer. We knew something was changing. Even locked behind barbed wire, you could feel it. The war wasn't over yet, but it was moving. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like it might eventually move in our favor. As the sound of artillery got closer, it became clear the front lines were shifting fast. That's when the Germans decided to move us out of the camp. It was the middle of summer, unbearably hot, and they marched us under that blazing sun until we reached a line of boxcars. Around noon, they started forcing us inside. As each car filled up, guards used bayonets to shove the men near the doors further in, cramming more bodies into an already packed space. Eventually, there was no room left to move, just people pressed tightly together, and then they slammed the doors shut. We stayed locked in those boxcars the entire day. There was no food, no water, and the heat kept rising. It became suffocating. After nightfall, the train finally started moving. We were taken toward what I believe was Lithuania, and from there they loaded us onto a coal ship. The conditions somehow got even worse. Down in the ship's hold, it was so overcrowded you couldn't sit, couldn't lie down, you just stood there. We stayed like that for 3.5 days. No food, no water. The floor was covered in a few inches of coal dust, which made it nearly impossible to keep your footing. Your legs would tremble and ache constantly from trying to stay balanced. There were no sanitary conditions at all. Many of us were sick from lack of food and poor diet, and there was nowhere to relieve ourselves except right where we stood. The air was thick, foul, and nearly unbearable. The heat from all those bodies packed together only made it worse. The only bit of ventilation came from a small opening above where we had been brought down. It's hard to even put into words what that felt like. When we finally reached our destination, they moved us again into boxcars. This time, we noticed something strange. The guards were incredibly young. They were part of Hitler Youth, just boys, really. I spoke some German, so I asked a couple of them how old they were. They told me they were only 12 or 13. Honestly, they seemed more nervous about us than we were of them. That train ride only lasted overnight, and we ended up in a place called Gdansk, Poland. Before we boarded, they made us put on our heavy overcoats, even though it was the height of summer, and then shackled us together in pairs. So there we were, sweating in the heat, chained up and uncomfortable. When we arrived, the German officers told us it was our lucky day. They said we'd each be given not just one Red Cross parcel, but 2. I could hardly believe it, but they handed them out, one under each arm. For a brief moment, it felt like something good might actually happen, but that feeling didn't last. The second everyone had their parcels, the order came: fix bayonets. Then they released dogs and forced us to run about 5 kilometers down the road. As we ran, they jabbed us with bayonets, and the dogs snapped at our legs. The parcels they had just given us started falling to the ground as people struggled to keep up. That was the whole point. They wanted an excuse to say we had thrown them away. By the time we reached the next location, we were completely drained. It had been over 4 days without proper food or water, all in brutal heat. They made us lie down in an open area while guards taunted us. There were water pumps nearby, and instead of letting us drink, they would pump water and throw it at us just to torture us further. Then, in the middle of all that misery, one of the American soldiers started singing "God Bless America." One by one, we all joined in. It was our way of pushing back, of holding on to something human in a place designed to break us. That only made the Germans angrier. Eventually, they threatened to shoot if we didn't stop, so we had no choice but to fall silent. After that came the strip searches. They took us one at a time and forced us to remove everything while they searched every inch of our belongings. When my turn came, I was one of the few who had managed to keep both of my Red Cross parcels. The guard assigned to search me was a man we called Ham Hands, one of the most brutal guards we had ever dealt with. He had a reputation for hurting prisoners whenever he could, snapping rifle butts against your feet, striking your ears, anything to cause pain. I hadn't even started undressing when he grabbed my parcels. I told him, in German, that those parcels were mine. He responded by smashing me in the head with his pistol. I hit the ground, dazed, but I kept insisting they belonged to me. 5 times he struck me, on the head, the face, until I was bleeding badly. At that point, I realized if I kept resisting, he might kill me right there. So I let go. The moment he turned away, I grabbed what I could and slipped back into the group of prisoners who had already been searched. I covered my head with my coat and pretended to be asleep. He came out looking for me, shouting and cursing, passing by me several times without realizing I was right there. Eventually, he gave up and went back inside. I can't describe the relief I felt. I'm certain that if he had found me, I wouldn't have survived. As the Russians continued advancing, the Germans forced us further west. There were no proper prison camps left, so we were put on what later became known as a death march. It lasted 86 days. During that entire time, we were never inside a heated building. Sometimes we slept in barns if we were lucky, but often it was just out in open fields. Each of us had a blanket, and we would group together, 5 men sharing warmth as best we could. Eventually, we were liberated by British forces. They treated us with real care and dignity. It had been more than a year since I'd had a proper bath. I was covered in dirt, lice, and fleas. I hadn't shaved in all that time either, just a thick, wild beard I couldn't stand. But none of that mattered as much as the fact that we were finally free. When I think back on it all, what I'm most proud of is that, in some small way, I helped protect our freedom. It's something many people take for granted. Most don't truly understand what it means to lose it, what it feels like to have it stripped away completely. I learned that the hard way. And once you've lived without freedom, you never look at it the same again. What you're hearing in that story is just one example of a much larger experience shared by thousands of Allied prisoners during World War II. Once captured, especially in the later stages of the war, conditions became increasingly chaotic and brutal. Germany was losing ground on multiple fronts, and as the Soviet army pushed in from the east, prison camps were no longer secure or sustainable. That's when mass evacuations began, often with very little planning and even less regard for the prisoners' survival. These forced movements, later called death marches, were some of the harshest experiences prisoners endured. Men were driven for miles in extreme weather, sometimes freezing cold, sometimes intense heat, with barely any food or water. Guards were often nervous, exhausted, and sometimes very young or poorly trained, which made them unpredictable. Anyone who couldn't keep up risked being beaten, left behind, or worse. The goal wasn't just relocation, it was control, and in many cases, survival of the prisoners was not a priority. Transportation during these evacuations was just as deadly. Boxcars were packed far beyond capacity, with no ventilation, no sanitation, and no provisions. In some cases, prisoners were transported by ship under equally horrific conditions. Standing for days without rest, breathing in foul air, and dealing with sickness and dehydration pushed many to their limits. Some didn't survive those journeys at all. The use of Red Cross parcels is another important part of the story. These packages, sent by organizations like the International Red Cross, were often the only reliable source of food and basic supplies prisoners received. They could contain canned meat, powdered milk, chocolate, and sometimes cigarettes or small personal items. For many prisoners, those parcels meant the difference between life and death. That's why the moment where they were handed out, and then effectively taken away through forced exhaustion, was especially cruel. It wasn't just physical punishment, it was psychological. The presence of very young guards, like members of the Hitler Youth, became more common toward the end of the war. Germany was running out of able-bodied soldiers, so boys barely in their teens were put into positions of authority. Many of them were indoctrinated from a young age, but at the same time, they lacked real experience. That created a strange dynamic. Some were overly aggressive, trying to prove themselves, while others were clearly afraid and unsure of what they were doing. Interrogations and searches were another constant pressure. Prisoners were expected to give only their name, rank, and serial number, according to the Geneva Convention. But not all guards or officers respected those rules. Violence was often used to try to extract more information, even though experienced prisoners knew that giving in would only make things worse. Resisting under those conditions required an incredible level of mental strength. Hygiene and health were constant struggles. With limited access to water, no proper medical care, and overcrowded living conditions, diseases spread quickly. Lice, fleas, and infections were common. Malnutrition weakened the body, making it harder to fight off illness. Even something as basic as a wound or cut could become treatment. Despite all of this, prisoners found ways to hold on to their identity and morale. Singing, sharing stories, helping each other stay warm, or even just refusing to give in during interrogation, those small acts mattered. They were ways of maintaining dignity in a situation designed to strip it away. That moment of singing together, even while being denied water, is a powerful example of that spirit. Liberation, when it finally came, was often overwhelming. Many prisoners were physically broken, underweight, sick, and exhausted, but the psychological impact ran just as deep. Some had been in captivity for years. Adjusting back to normal life wasn't immediate. This story is not just about the cruelty of war, but about the incredible strength of the human spirit. Even in the face of unimaginable suffering, these men refused to lose their dignity, their courage, or their hope. Their resilience teaches us that true strength is not in power, but in endurance and unity. As we remember their journey, let it remind us to value freedom, stand against injustice, and never take humanity for granted.